Well, on bad mornings, and bad mornings sometimes come before lovely evenings like this, but on bad mornings I sometimes wake up and think we've gone back in time. And I wonder whether you recognise this picture. You probably all do. Some of you have said to me, is this ENIAC? It is ENIAC. These were the early days of computing, and women were central to computing in their early days. They were programmers, they were systems developers, they were project leaders, they were code breakers. But we tend to forget that nowadays because today women are to be found in large numbers, but mainly in assembly plants in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world far from Europe, assembling integrated circuits and turning their eyesight into dust, basically, as they look through microscopes. Where are the women in professional ICT jobs is one of the questions I want to ask in this seminar. And what I want to answer with is, what do we do about it? What do we do about the problem? The problem is that women are underrepresented in ICT professions in all major industrialized countries. They're less than 20% of ICT professionals in most OECD countries. And you won't be able to see, perhaps, with this expanded screen, the details of, I don't know whether you can see the details of the bars, but what you'd get is the general impression that women represent about 1/5 of ICT professionals. And the problem doesn't stop there because their numbers are dropping. Their share of ICT work has decreased since 2001. This is a graph that shows the state of play in the United Kingdom, and the bottom line here shows the decrease in women in ICT professions from 2001 to 2008. And without looking too specifically at the numbers involved, the decrease that took place was from 23% in 2000 down to 19% last year. And that's a pattern that's replicated across the European Union and across many countries. So, why is this a problem? Why should we care about the underrepresentation of women in ICTs? Well, there's lots of reasons to do so. If we're feminists like I am, we would care on the grounds of equality because we're interested in improving women's access to quality work and good jobs. And this actually is also one of the projects of the European Union in its Lisbon strategy. We might also be interested just for general purposes of pursuing social justice, which long deserves to be done. But governments too are interested in this question, where they wish to compete in the knowledge economy, and most governments in Europe do wish to improve their economic competitiveness in this area, and to raise women's employment rates, and so sometimes to wean them off benefits and benefit dependency. And women's employment rates still stand well below men's across the European Union. Companies have an interest in this issue, employing companies and employing organisations, not just the private sector, but the public sector too. They're interested in increasing the labour supply. They're interested in widening the amount of the different diversity of skill that they have available to them, and so improve their own performance through deploying that diversity to better meet the needs of the customers they serve. So companies constantly raise the issue of wanting to recruit more women into ICT professions and constantly lament the fact that they have difficulty in doing so. But what I want to say in this talk this evening is that I don't think there's yet an obvious solution to the problem or the issue of women's underrepresentation. What I've tried to show in this last couple of graphs that you've seen is how stubbornly women remain underrepresented in this field, the field of ICT professions, and that their participation rates are dropping steadily. And we don't really know what to do about it. There have been interventions that have been carried out in my own country, the UK, in Spain, through the Plan Avanza and the gender equality strand of the Plan Avanza, among others, and in other countries too. But from what I can see, interventions to date have actually made very little difference to the participation levels of women. And I think that's an issue for concern. It's an issue of concern to all of us who are interested in doing research in this issue and in trying to change the world through our research, as many of us do want to do. So what I want to talk about today is what has been done about this issue and what we might learn from the interventions that have been tried with greater or lesser success. So what I'm basically going to argue is that I think we need a better way of, first of all, understanding women's underrepresentation and absence from ICT than perhaps we've had up until now. And then, using that understanding, we need a better way of tackling the problem, or we need to deploy that understanding to tackle the problem. So I'm going to talk first of all about what we call a life cycle approach, which I think is the most useful way of understanding the issue. And I'm going to show how that helps to illuminate the issue of how girls and women start to disappear through their life cycles, through their lifetimes from the ICT world. And I'm going to talk then about what public policy has done to try and attack the problem at various points, and where it's been effective and ineffective. I think it's been largely ineffective. And then I'm going to talk about an intervention in the UK called the UKRC, the UK Resource Centre for Women in Science, Engineering and Technology, the UKRC for Women in SET. And I'm going to look at the approach that it's taken, which is called, not only by me but by others who've looked at this centre, a holistic approach to the problem. And I'm going to argue that that's the only way for trying to get any form of social change in this area. And even then, it's been fraught with difficulties. So, what I want to say first of all is that the life cycle approach then, I think, is the most useful way of understanding the issue. And I want to start by contrasting that with the conventional way that we have of dealing with this issue, which is often called the leaky pipeline. And the leaky pipeline is a really familiar concept to anybody who works in the issue of gender science and technology. It's the analogy that's used to express the fact that girls start off in ICT on a roughly equal footing with boys in school. They perform at roughly equal levels, certainly in early secondary school. And then at some point in secondary school, they start to lose interest. They start to drift out of ICT studies. By the time you get to the end of secondary school, they're almost, they're taking up ICT further study in very small numbers indeed. And by the time you have girls going into university, their numbers have dropped away further. And by the time they reach the labour market, the pool of women who employers can access is very small indeed. And this is the constant lament that's made by employers. They find it very hard to even find a pool of women to recruit from, even if they're minded to utilise equalities approaches. They don't find the women who are available. And the leaky pipeline approach then goes on to argue that, furthermore, women don't progress through ICT professions, so they're found in very small numbers because by the time we get to the top of organisations, they've almost completely dribbled away. There's nothing wrong with the message that the leaky pipeline approach takes, I think, but I do think that there are problems with this analogy, and I want to just raise one or two of them in order to try and illustrate the reasons why we're taking a different strategy and a different tack, and why too I think that public policy has to take the same different strategy. First of all, I think the problem is that the leaky pipeline approach is a rather demand-led conception. In other words, it starts from the perspective of employers, and it sees the labour pool as being some kind of pipeline of labour supply that is available to it, but sort of trickles and leaks, literally leaks away human resource. So it's a rather demand-led kind of conception, and being demand-led, it doesn't really have much idea of what's going on in the minds or the actions of women themselves. It's very much focused on the labour market and the feed into the labour market. What it doesn't have much sense of is what's going on in wider society. And I think that what goes on in wider society, and this might seem like a truism, is absolutely obviously essential for an understanding of what happens in ICT professions and why women are not there in large numbers. So that's the first problem with the leaky pipeline approach. The second problem, in my view, is that it separates education and employment in its thinking, as it were. It suggests this kind of step-by-step pathway that people take. They go first through secondary education, then they go through higher education, perhaps they go to further degrees, and then they go into the labour market. But the problem with that is, of course, that more and more in the knowledge economy, education and employment don't operate on a linear pathway at all. And more we're told they should not do so. That in fact we're all in the business of lifelong learning, that we learn throughout life. We do not only learn in formal education institutions, we learn in the workplace, in our communities, in society, in the family, and so we ought to be doing. And to posit this kind of linear pathway that we all take from education to employment simply doesn't acknowledge the reality of the way that the knowledge economy, the so-called knowledge society is evolving, and indeed how we think it should evolve. So that's a second problem. A third problem with that very conventional conception is also linked to this linear conception. It means too that it doesn't have much space for understanding what we might call, at least by male standards, non-traditional trajectories, development paths. And women don't have traditional trajectories. Classically, they don't. They don't go from education to employment and then move in a straightforward fashion through employment, up through organisations and through to retirement. They go out of employment, they go through maternity, they re-enter employment on different terms than when they first started. Their life cycles are quite different from men's. And the leaky pipeline approach, again, doesn't really take account of those kind of pressures that particularly come to bear on women's working lives through their life cycles at all. So that's another reason for abandoning the leaky pipeline metaphor. And finally, fourthly and finally, as I said earlier, I don't think it really takes account of the wider context within which women engage with or don't engage with information and communication technologies. There are lots of reasons why women are not to be found in large numbers in this field, and they're not only to do with the field itself, they're to do with a whole range of other factors. For example, social, cultural, political factors play a huge role. And I think in women's lives in particular, no study at all, no public policy action at all will ever be effective if it doesn't take account of domestic labour, domestic relations, women's role in the domestic. That is absolutely vital for an understanding of women's relationship to the labour market. And in different societies, those kinds of relationships play out differently. Family structures are different, very different, for example, in Spain than from what they are in the UK. What Effinger has called breadwinner models are very different in different countries. That is, the emphasis that's placed on the male breadwinner, the female part-time worker, or the male breadwinner, the female housewife. Those kinds of models of domestic labour and family configuration operate very differently in different countries for cultural and historical, religious, political and other reasons. And it's, I think, vital for us to get a grip on those wider contextual factors in order to be able to understand what's happening to women as they go in and out of ICT. And there's also things like cultural attitudes to working women, vital. Provision of childcare support, provision of elderly care support, all sorts of practical support mechanisms, particularly for working mothers, that play a vital role in shaping their relationship to any labour market, but particularly, I want to argue, the ICT labour market. So, just to recap then for a second, I think that the life cycle approach is much more useful than that conventional approach. And in a moment, I'm going to take you through what we think that might look like. And this is a first pass, I should say. And then talk a bit about how girls and women disappear and some of the research that we've found, which shows at the points at which they disappear, the transition points in their working lives. And finally, to talk about ineffective public policy and potentially, in the case of the UKRC, effective public policy. Now, this is a very busy diagram, and I think rather than try and ruin your eyesight by reading the tiny text, let me just point you to the sort of key points. This is our first attempt to conceptualise, and I say our because this is the sort of first stabbings at a conceptual framework that that Rachel Parmen and Cecilia Castagno and I am involved with, where we are trying to look at the factors involved in including and excluding women from ICT work in Spain and in the UK, and to look at the public policy interventions that have resulted. So very, very early on in the project, we drew this diagram here, and these are this is basically a woman's life cycle here. It's not really meant to be as linear as it looks, but for the purposes of a graph, that's how, I'm afraid, until we find a better way of showing it, it's got to look. And this is how we think it might apply to the UK, and it might be different for Spain. But you have a series of factors that operate at primary education, which have to do with, for instance, gender balance and behaviour of teachers, availability of computing resources, gender behaviours around they start in computers, things that start in primary school and go through to the formation of gender identity in secondary school, among teenagers in particular, and then moving on as children go through school and out of school to the quality of careers advice, the gender balance, you get into university and deal with the gender balance of students, the culture of computing education in university, and things like bullying and sexual harassment that goes on of female students in computing education, some of which has been identified in the United States and in Britain. And then thinking about the move to employment, we start to see women disappearing through firm recruitment practices, through the culture of IT workplaces, through the sort of siphoning off of talent into other sectors, non-IT. In Britain, for example, a lot of graduates in science, engineering and technology end up in financial services. They don't go anywhere near information and communication technology sectors. They get poached, basically. Why? And then we go through employment, and for women who have children, and not all women do evidently, there are issues around early motherhood and how the organisation of the sector deals with and supports or doesn't support women who have kids. We go on through later motherhood and into return to the labour market, which has been found to be a really major transition point for many women, not least because, again, employers in the ICT sector seem to be particularly poor at dealing with women returners and catering to their circumstances. And finally, we come to mid-career and end of career. And another transition point that I suspect exists, but I have no evidence of this yet, is when women come to mid-career and companies, particularly at the moment this is true, are making redundancies. And I have heard anecdotal evidence that women in mid-career are particularly vulnerable to redundancies in the ICT sector. And I don't think there's any hard research evidence to support this assertion yet, but to me that seems like it might be a plausible assumption based on what I know about the way in which equality programs in organisations in general suffer in periods of recession and slump. So this is the kind of approach that we want to apply, and so up at the top, above all this, there must be a bubble or some kind of box that deals with the legislative arrangements of the country we're talking about, the cultural approaches to women working, the support for childcare, the support for elderly care, all the things that have nothing to do with the ICT sector specifically, and actually don't have much to do with the labour market, but have to do with the lives that women and men lead in their particular countries, their real lives. And all of that, I think, has to be factored into an understanding of where women are and why they are where they are. So let's just then look at some of the issues specifically that come to bear throughout the life cycle and what they mean for women in ICT. If we start by the education sphere, we know first of all that parents and teachers are very decisive for girls' orientation to computing. And if we think first of all about parents, we know that parents influence the formation of gender identities in children of both sexes and provide role models for children of both sexes. And there is some research evidence, but mainly from the States that I know of, which has looked at the way in which fathers work with boys around computers in the home and make computers available to boys specifically. Certainly by the time children come to school, it becomes evident that with a domination of school computing teaching by men, children very quickly learn that computing is primarily about boys and for boys. And again, one of the things that we're going to do in the project that we're just embarking on at the moment, Rachel, Cecilia and I, is to try and actually get some hard data on the sex and the sex of teachers in computing at primary and secondary education level in order to test out that assumption. But we know that teachers provide role models, and we know too that they construct their own stereotypes. And here there's some quite interesting research from the OECD that actually has drawn on data from the States, which shows how teachers tend to view their students more positively if they're of the same sex and incidentally the same ethnic background. And I think that then, if you then couple that, if we then find that there's a domination of computing teaching by men, that might suggest that there are all sorts of hidden, what we might call hidden curriculum issues going on in the classroom that serve gradually, imperceptibly to culturally exclude girls. There are also some real material problems around education that have been noted in the UK, and they have to do with the nature of teacher education, which is all important, because teachers, it seems, in the UK are profoundly unaware of how girls and boys both construct and experience new technologies, and they certainly receive no grounding in this area through their teacher education. So they go into teaching computing and ICT with a terribly gender-neutral perspective on computing. They really do not understand how to address gender issues or how to promote gender awareness in computing. And now, given that at the same time we have a government in the UK that is starting to make policy pronouncements about how computing is gendered and gender awareness ought to be embedded within the endeavour, you would think that a good place to start would be in computer teacher training, but that hasn't happened to date in the UK. And indeed, there's even some evidence in the UK that shows that teachers will rely on sexualised images of girls in order to teach children of both sexes about computing gadgets. You know, magazines, sort of boys' magazines of gadgets which feature women in bikinis on the front. All of which, of course, serves to send girls subtle messages about what computing is for, who it's for, and who it's not for. So, in addition to the role of teachers and parents, we find too that the curriculum is really decisive. And again, research that we've seen in the UK suggests that the secondary school curriculum actually in substance doesn't differ very much from the primary school curriculum. And therein lies a problem, because at secondary school it appears that students start to get switched off from computing studies because they're not learning very much new, and because the substance of what they do learn focuses on the use of applications. And there's only so much you can study about the use of applications before you get extremely bored. And what tends to happen then is that girls get bored with using computers or with learning computing because they're simply learning the technical application, and because as they start to form their gender identities, they begin to express a particular interest in the social application of computing. And we find this is a recurrent research finding that comes up time and again, that girls and women are interested in computing and indeed science and technology more generally when they can deploy it for some kind of social purpose, rather than for a kind of artifactual development in its own right, we might say. So in secondary school, the curriculum then starts to operate, to start to cause disinterest in both sexes, I would say, but particularly among girls. And one of the reasons it is suspected by researchers in the UK is that boys continue to maintain any interest at all is because they do gaming at home. And so that kind of keeps them engaged in computing, by which time girls have switched off and started to form social networks and develop social lives. I'm talking now about teenagers. And then what we call, or what Connell has called, hegemonic gender norms are decisive. Now, hegemonic gender norms are basically norms that govern ideal masculine and feminine identities and behaviours, and they're strongly influential on teenagers. It's at the point of teenagehood where adolescents start to form their gender identities and start to establish them. And hegemonic gender norms are constructed throughout society and throughout all our lives, but they're particularly powerful in teenage years. And they're constructed by parents, by teachers, by children and others. And I think what's really important is that it's at this point that people like Ursula Cassells have shown the ways in which girls and boys start to select for study subjects that they think will make them seem more attractive, males and females, to their peers and their colleagues. And so they choose academic subjects in part by a desire to show themselves as being attractive individuals within the context of the gender norms that they evolve. And their peers start to reinforce that gender stereotypical behaviour and punish non-conformity. So we get this sort of powerful set of processes operating in secondary education around teenagehood, in which students themselves start to construct their gender identities and punish each other for not conforming to an ideal type. And that hidden curriculum is reinforced by parents and teachers who can both undermine, encourage and support girls from choosing technical subjects at secondary school. But I think it's important to say at this point, though, that dominant masculinities and dominant femininities can change over time. They're not fixed, they're socially constructed, and that means that there is some room for negotiation around what is a gender stereotypical model of masculinity or femininity. And in fact, I think that certainly in British society at the moment, and I'd like to bet it's also true in Spanish society, the construction of ideal typical masculinity certainly is changing enormously, has changed enormously in the last 10 years. And some might say has been under enormous challenge. And we see that in the way that boys are underperforming in school. But what it does mean is that this kind of shaping of gender identity and gender behaviour constantly undergoes review and renegotiation by kids themselves. So I think it's important not to oversimplify or fix in stone males and females' experience or identities. Now, there is also a synergy that's been pointed to between computing culture and masculine culture. Judy Wiseman has drawn attention to this synergy on many occasions, and it's been argued that synergy expresses itself in many ways, from the use of jargon to describe hardware, the language of computing, the gaming culture of computing, object-oriented approaches to problem solving, the idea of the focus that boys particularly may have on IT artifacts and issues to the point of obsession, the valuing of speed and power as opposed to usability. All these things are seen by Cahoon and Asprey as evidence of a kind of masculine culture of computing. And in the UK specifically, it seems that this is borne out by the way that boys sustain their interest in computing at school through gaming. And what we find, again, this is UK data from a small set of case studies, admittedly, but Pow and her colleagues have found that girls start to lose interest in IT subjects when they enter secondary school, but they particularly lose interest at about year 7, which equates to age 12. And they start to be switched off computing studies, even though around about this age here, year 8, sorry, even though they still sometimes anticipate that they may end up having a computing career. I don't quite know how Pow-et-al. Arrived at that discrepancy, but I am very interested in these blue blocks here, showing the sort of fall off in interest that their interviewees expressed. And so we get to the point where in the UK this year, in fact, 10 times as many boys as girls took computing at A level. That's the equivalent of bachillerato here in Spain. And nearly twice as many boys as girls took IT A-level. So computing on the left, IT on the right. And I think the other point of issue that I want to just sort of draw attention to in relation to schooling is then what happens when boys and girls start to access careers advice. I've done some research on what happens to children as they sort of try to access careers advice, and certainly in the UK, careers advice into computing is really poor. And girls' and women's appreciation of what computing careers offer or consist of is also really poor. So you still get, despite the fact that we're now 30 years into the sort of what we used to call the microelectronics revolution back in the 1980s, 30 years on, you still get young girls and young women saying things like, computing involves sitting in front of a computer screen all day, tapping away at a keyboard. Despite the fact that there are endless attempts by public policymakers and others to show how this isn't the case at all, and actually computing career is far more complicated. But nevertheless, the lack of careers advice and the lack of clarity around the computing career means that there is a very poor understanding of what's involved in a career, in computing career. And couple that with the fact that girls and young women are starting to evolve an interest in IT only insofar as it has a social application, with a social orientation, and their preferences start to become even clearer. So a recent report carried out by the IT company Cisco found that 90% of girls in the survey that they did are looking for jobs involving helping others, and only 60% of girls see ICT roles as having anything to do with in helping others. And also, the same report found that girls' connectedness with computing has to do with using computing for leisure and for making social connections with their friends, in other words, but not for using computing at work and in workplaces. That's not how they see computing as being intriguing. Now, when we come onto higher education, here's a thing. In the UK, women are becoming a greater and greater proportion of university students in general. Not science, engineering and technology students, not at all. But in universities, women are the majority of university students, and by 2025 they're expected by the OECD to be over 70% of university students. So there is a huge gap opening up between women's performance in school, first of all, which is far outstripping boys now, and their performance in university and their presence in university, which finds no parallel whatsoever in the world of ICT or studies of ICT. So there are a small minority of computing science students. 25% of new entrants to computing courses still at UK universities. I haven't got comparable figures, but they're 20% of computer graduates across the EU as a whole, and 44% of advanced research students in all subject areas. So an almost equal proportion of higher degrees, but not in computing science. So just really to reinforce the point that there is this huge imbalance between what's going on in computing and what's going on in education and the labour market more generally. And the OECD also recently found that the percentage of female students expecting to have a career in computer science, that's university students who are looking forward and thinking that they might, when graduating, go into computing science, the percentage of them expecting to do so and to be in that career by age 30 is 2%. So women are not expecting to go into computing when they leave university, and if they expect to go in, they're not expecting to stay there until they're 30 years old. Now, there's some incredibly important and informative research done in the States, which I know of no parallel in the UK or in Spain at the moment, or possibly in Spain there is. But certainly there isn't in the UK, which has attempted to look at what is wrong with computing science as a degree culture and what can be done about it. And this is Fisher and Margolis's work, closing the clubhouse door at Carnegie Mellon University. And they draw attention to a whole suite of issues relating to this culture of computing science at degree level, that students are often taught without reference, they say, to the context and practice of computing work. And I think this is extremely important. They're pointing to things like, in the third point down, the speed of programming being highly valued, the usability, the applicability, the transferability, the sustainability of computing being dealt with not at all in computer science education. They also note that hacker skills are highly valued, both as an entry qualification and again when students are actually working in computer science at degree level, and they're highly marked. And they point to the fact that staff are very poorly equipped because, again, they're not very gender aware. They don't receive gender awareness training as part of their own academic training. In fact, I think none of us do. So they're very poorly equipped to support women and other groups when they fall behind. And women are disproportionately then affected by poor teaching, hostile peers, and unapproachable staff. Disproportionately affected because they start to need more support which is not available to them. And when we go into the employment sphere, although some UK magazines about computing have labelled women clueless, and that was a couple of months ago, clueless about ICT work, and I would argue they're not clueless. They're by this time pretty disaffected, disinterested and excluded. I've already said that they develop a preference for work that's socially connected, and they get and with a social application, and they get poor advice about what is involved in computing work. Such poor advice, in fact, I think that this is a mind map that was done for the Women in Science and Engineering campaign in the UK, and it's basically a promotional mind map that they use which they take out to schools where they do lectures at secondary schools in order to alert girls to the fact that computing careers are far more multidimensional and far more interpersonal and far more socially useful than they might think. I mean, I think this is actually rather a good idea, but it's also indicative of the fact that this kind of knowledge is not very readily available in the general kind of careers advice discourse about how computing careers computing careers might offer. By the time women go then into employment, as I said, they're not clueless, but they're disinterested, and they then hit recruitment methods that are used by ICT employers, which often serve to filter out female candidates. A lot of companies now use internet recruiting and employee referral schemes. And employee referral schemes carry a clear risk, gender risk, obviously, because if you use an already male-dominated labour force in order to refer, in order to find your incoming labour force, then you're very likely to filter out female candidates in favour of male candidates. Equally, if you use internet recruiting mechanisms, you may well discriminate in favour of men. And recent publicity for computing companies, as I said, has labelled women clueless about technology. This was Computer Weekly, which is a major trade magazine in the UK, and published this remark just back in September. And I think, you know, with that kind of attitude, we've still got a long way to go. And then the conditions of work, and this is important because this is the kind of thing that social interventions, social policy interventions have to get to grips with. They create gender disadvantage. Ruth Woodfield in the UK has done a lot of work on the place of women in teams in ICT work and has found that often their place and their role is based on preconceived ideas of where they belong. For instance, they're often located in project management or project facilitation roles, which are thought to play very nicely to their inherent skills. But in fact, what happens is that although the hybrid skills, the mixture of social and technical skills that women are supposed to have in abundance, are seen to be important. In fact, there's no real mechanism in the ICT sector, or indeed in many sectors, for valuing and paying for those skills. There's no sort of skills evaluation framework that deals with the various natures of the hybrid. So although the hybridity is supposed to be important, nobody quite knows how to value it, and it's not done in the ICT world very routinely. Ruth Woodfield also declares that from her research, which is case study based, men are much more likely to stand out in teams as all-rounders than women are, precisely because it's not expected that they will have social skills, so it's seen to be exceptional and therefore something that merits reward. But as well as that, there is a hard reason, which is that technical skills atrophy quickly. In ICT work in particular, it's imperative to keep up professional skills and to keep them current. And this starts to become a problem the minute somebody leaves the labour market for any length of time. And the mechanisms by which women may keep their skills current and constant, if they leave the labour market for a career break, for example to have children, or indeed to look after elderly parents, or just for a career break, never mind whether for whatever reason, they start to be disadvantaged by their lack of currency of their skills. And there's a hardship culture, which I just want to talk very quickly about, what Sorensen has called a hardship culture in ICT work. And by that he means the culture of long hours working, total availability, being present on the client's work site, and if you like, the self-exploitation culture which a lot of ICT professionals put themselves through. They're not necessarily being expected to be present, but they are present. They're online all the time. The new phrase for this is hyperconnectedness, the idea that ICT professionals are always online through their Blackberries, their computers, or whatever. And I'm just going to move very quickly on. This is a graph showing the predominance of women in low-grade occupations. Here are the women in the dark blocks. They predominate as database assistants and clerks. There are only 14% of ICT strategists and professionals, planning professionals. So there are reasons to be very pessimistic, I'm afraid, still, about the presence of women in ICTs. And what I'd like to do now with the rest of the lecture is to talk for a few more minutes about what has been done in public policy terms in the UK to deal with this problem, and where it's been good and successful and where it's been problematic, in order to draw out some conclusions about what we might think about in designing future public policy interventions. So what have we done in the UK? This is complicated, but what I want to just draw your attention to here is the fact that these are all interventions that were kicked into play in around the 1980s, largely by professional associations, local authorities, local government, a university and a training organisation. And the point of this slide is to show you that almost invariably what they were doing was to target the intervention at the individual women, because the whole thinking behind the intervention was that it was women that were the problem. It was women's lack of awareness that meant that they simply weren't entering this wonderful new field of work that was open to them. And all they had to do was to have their awareness raised about what ICT work offered them, and they would flock in their droves. Now, these campaigns were all sort of fairly patchy in their coverage. They all had slightly different ambitions, but they were all very tactical, not very strategic. And as you see, most of them focused on adding women in to an existing world of ICT that was not in any way interrogated or scrutinised or challenged. At the same time, we had a national government that was almost entirely gender blind, and if we look back to the 1980s and trace our history in the UK, we can uncover a series of national reports, all of which emphasised the importance of economic competitiveness, the importance of ICT for boosting economic competitiveness, but paid no attention whatsoever to this sort of missing pool of labour that might help to do that. And that was how we went through the 1980s, with this focus on competitiveness, but no conception of the gender structure of the industry and how the industry itself might, in all its guises, be contributing to the lack of competitiveness that we were experiencing. So all that sort of issue around the social and the conditions of work in ICT and science, engineering and technology were really not part of the remit of either these initiatives here or of government. And so we went on through this, what Theresa Rees would call this phase, where we were tinkering, as she would put it, with the situation, and therefore achieving very little, not really attempting any fundamental innovation whatsoever. And that wasn't unique to the UK either, because I was involved in a European project in the early part of the 2000s, and one of our tasks in that project was to look at the interventions that were being tried in the various countries that we were covering. It was 5 countries, or 6 country study. And when we came to look at all these various good practice measures, what we found was that, almost without exception, they were very, very limited in scope, they were very short-term indeed, and they had a very limited effect indeed. So this wasn't a peculiarly British problem, but I think it had something to do with the way the interventions were conceived and the ambitions that they had. And so by the time we came up to the turn of the century, the sort of 2000, we had an estimation by the University of Warwick in relation to the UK that the industry was going to need about 340,000 extra IT professionals in order to meet the sector's growing demand for labour as we went into the new century. And needless to say, they haven't succeeded in recruiting anything like that number, and particularly not in relation to women. We also had something like 70 organisations in the UK dedicated to increasing the participation of women in SET. Committees in professional societies, we had national and regional membership networks, we had initiatives and schemes funded by the public sector, initiatives for the private sector, but still no coherent government strategy on this. No infrastructure, low levels of resource, duplication of effort, the same thing being done by different organisations in different parts of the UK in slightly different areas. Until we came to 2002, when our Baroness Susan Greenfield, who is a brain scientist, was commissioned to produce a report to look at the issue, the perpetual and long-standing problem of women's absence from science, engineering and technology. And the Greenfield report, so-called, finally recommended the establishment of something like a strategic and coherent national centre to get to grips with this problem. And that really brings us up to 5 years ago, because our government then adopted her recommendations and established the UK Resource Centre for Women in Science, Engineering and Technology. The UK Resource Centre, I think, is a major departure from previous initiatives. And it's a major departure in a number of ways, which personally I think are important, but I think they're important intellectually too. First of all, the scope and ambition of what the centre promised to do was far outstripped anything that had ever been done in the past. And I'll talk a bit about its scope and ambition in a minute and show you the kinds of work that it engages in. But I think too it was important that it was conceived from a feminist perspective by feminist activists who'd been working for a long time in this field, and who conceived the problem as being about the need to challenge the structural and cultural conditions of the sector, and not just to tinker with the awareness of individual women. And so they stated that their core values were, and this was something that appeared in one of the early programming documents, that there had to be a change in the organisation and culture of SET learning and work environments, including changes in the institutional systems, processes and structures. No other intervention had ever attempted to touch the institutions of science, engineering and technology before. And I think that kind of conception is vital, because it starts to get to grips with some of these complex, multidimensional issues that we're starting to uncover in the team here, which all serve in an interconnected way to exclude women from this field of endeavour. One of their other core values, which I think says the same thing, was that women are often limited in their choice of career and the position they reach by external barriers, emphasis on external barriers that inhibit their true potential. Positive action is therefore an integral part of the approach as a tool for giving women improved access to careers in science, engineering and technology. So again, positive action in the UK has a rather bad odour because people often mistake it for positive discrimination, whereas in fact positive action is a perfectly legitimate tool for achieving gender equality, and particularly in a field like this. So we're talking about a series of structural barriers, and the UKRC conceives of these as operating in these interlocking spheres. So we have things like schools, options, qualifications, careers, education, advice, education and training environments, employment policies and practices, professional institutes, and so on, government legislation. What they're saying is that intervention is needed on all these fronts, and they all intersect. And in a way, this is exactly the same as the life cycle model, but thought differently, because here what they're doing is identifying the institutional and social areas that need an intervention. So what it does is it targets, the UKRC targets key sectors and organisations in the landscape of ICT, science, engineering and technology. And I think that no other organisation does that. And I think that's why it's interesting. And it's complex, this kind of project, for several reasons, because it's cross-disciplinary, it's cross-sectoral, so they're working across employment, they're working across education, they're working in schooling, they're working in universities, they're working with individual women, they're working with the media. They're operating both at the demand side of the labour market and at the supply side of the labour market, so working with employers and with women. And they're operating both in policy and practical areas, so trying to influence government, but also working on the ground with institutions, with educational institutions, with individual women and so on. And I want to pick one example of the kind of topic area they work in. These are the areas of activity which follow the holistic model. So you can see they do work in all these areas, and I particularly want to focus on this one here, supporting women employees and returners to SET, so science, engineering and technology. Because I think this is a particularly important area of their work, and it's one where they're particularly well resourced. And sorry, go straight on from that one. Here are the kind of services that they offer just for returners. And I just put this slide up in order to show you the kind of comprehensiveness of the endeavour. So they have started an Open University course, something similar to what the Open University of Catalonia could do, in fact, which is an online course for women returners to enable them to get advice get advice about current careers, understand the ICT landscape as it is currently configured, sharpen their CVs, get tutoring help, get support from co-students. When they come out of that course, those of them who do it, not everyone does it, they're then fed into another area of the UKRC where they receive CV support and review, one-to-one career advice, person to person, peer mentoring and ordinary mentoring. They're invited to networking events where they meet potential employers, and some of them are placed in short-term placements in the first instance with by an organisation called Year in Industry, with which the UKRC works, with which it has a partnership to take women returners and place them in employers' vacancies. So it's a kind of job matching scheme in a way, but it's a job matching scheme that's highly valued both by the employers and by the women, because what it's done is to raise employers' consciousness about the particular problems that face women returners, and to get them thinking about how they might modify their employment policies, and particularly their policies around maternity, to encourage women to return and to give them confidence to return, because a lot of women returners to the labour market, particularly in this sphere, lose an enormous amount of self-confidence during their career breaks because they know that their skills are depleting very rapidly. So this kind of set of integrated suite of activities is not only deemed by both employers and returners to be useful, but it's enormously comprehensive, as you can see. And if you think about that kind of activity multiplied by all the areas of activity that the UKRC works in, you start to get the beginnings of an idea of the comprehensiveness and the ambitions of the endeavour. It's enormous, absolutely enormous. So, on paper so far it all looks good. But then I return to this horrible statistic that I showed you at the beginning. I just want to remind you about the fact, and it hasn't gone away, that we still have the number of women in science, engineering and technology dropping in the UK. And so we're faced with the problem that despite all this effort and despite all this very well conceived work, we haven't really made much difference in the ICT labour market. And so just to end with, I want to sort of offer some reflections about why I think that's so and what we might learn from why that might be so, because I think it's really important. First of all, we could ask the question whether this very holistic model, which is very conceptually coherent, very politically coherent, but the question still remains, is it actually an effective model for an intervention, for a social intervention like this? Because we've still got the problem we've got of women's underrepresentation. Well, several responses to that question. There are a number of problems with it. And in an evaluation that was done of the UKRC's work, in fact, two evaluations that were done of the UKRC's work, first one by myself and another colleague, Marion Scott, and then by a team at the Tavistock Institute, we found that there was no evidence that anyone was taking that model. Let me just go back to the model for a minute. This model here. No one was really taking that model of activity and subjecting it to any scrutiny or evaluation in terms of whether it actually works. In other words, there's no intelligence about whether it's effective to have all these interlinked activities, how an intervention in one area might change the situation in another area, what the linkage points are, how, in other words, the individual elements of the model relate to one another in practice rather than in theory. We all know about how they work in theory because we all write papers about it, but how do they work in practice? So no evaluation has really tackled this issue or been asked to tackle this issue, and as a result, neither the UKRC nor anyone else really knows how this, which bits of this are effective and how well they work together or individually. So that's one issue. The second thing is that the model might just be too theoretical. It might work very well as a conceptual model. For us academics, it might be extremely sort of pleasing to think about the this sort of complex interplay of factors in which you throw everything into your model and hope that you've basically covered all your ground. But does that work very well when you're talking about a social intervention in which you actually want to recruit and marshal the efforts of NGOs, grassroots organisations, stakeholders, people working on the ground who may not be very interested in theoretical models but who are working in a very small area of practice? So possibly it is suggested the model may be too theoretical. I don't know. I offer these just as questions. I think, though, that one problem with this is that I think there's an implementation problem rather than a design problem here. And by that I mean that I think it requires enormous time, expertise, and particularly resources, huge resources, as we all know, to successfully operate anything like a holistic model like this one and get results out at the end. And it requires sustained and embedded resources. One of the things that we're trying to do within the project, Rachel, Cecilia and myself, is to apply a model of successful gender equality change which if you like, privileges the notion of embedded, sustainable, holistic and wide-ranging intervention as being the sort of the most effective way forward, with the emphasis, I think, being on embedded. And I say that because this model's only been in operation for 5 years, and we all know that 5 years is a fantastically short time to attempt to make any kind of cultural change in any landscape whatsoever. And any one of us who's tried to do it knows that. So I think there's an implementation issue, which is that this model needs longer. However, of course, it's operating within a political time frame where it's got to produce short results quickly. The politicians want to see changes and improvements in the numbers of women taking science, engineering and technology. And what they're pressurising the UKRC to do is to show those literally the numbers of women that have changed. And that's a tricky one. That's a difficult one to pull. More seriously, I think, is the danger that something that's so holistic like this, if it also suffers from depleted or few resources, and this model does, because the UKRC received something like a 50% cut in its funding halfway through its life, largely as the result of a large European funding stream ending. When that happens, you have the same staff resource, or even arguably fewer, spreading themselves around, trying to actually tackle all these areas at once. And what it has been argued has happened in the UKRC is that it's spread itself too thinly, basically. So that too is something that might undermine its effectiveness and its ability to sort of really make a difference. And I think then, finally, that raises the question that's perhaps what we want to sort of be concerned with more generally, which is how we measure the impact of an initiative. How would it be? What would we say to make it effective? Is it about reaching targets, government targets? Is it about showing the government that we have indeed introduced so many more women to computing and information technology? Well, I think numerical targets are certainly measurable, they're certainly politically popular, but they're very mechanical and I think managerial as well. And I think they often reduce what is a complex process of cultural change to something that's sort of little more than an accounting exercise. And for that reason, I think that numerical targets alone do not really, I think, give much evidence of sustained impact of an initiative. So I would say no. However, we might argue that the impact that's come from the UKRC in particular has been on individuals rather than on, you know, the huge ICT landscape. And I certainly have picked that up in the evaluation that I did with the stakeholders in the UKRC, because a lot of the women that we interviewed who had gone through the returner service pointed to the massive improvements that their engagement with the UKRC and its services had made in their confidence, in their skills at job searching, in their skills at putting together CVs, quite basic stuff. Their interview skills, their presentation skills and so on, they said had all massively improved. Difficult to measure the direct and the numerical outcome of that, but for them it was vitally important. Employers too made the comment that although they weren't necessarily recruiting more women, they definitely felt that the climate had changed, and so that the UKRC had had a discernible impact on changing the climate that they had created within their organisations for employing women, for retaining women after maternity, and for promoting women. They started to review things like their written policies, their HR practices, that kind of thing. And then finally, obviously, an impact may not be apparent for a very long time, and I think that that's very much the situation with the UKRC. And these sort of things take a great deal of time to play out. An impact also may be indirect rather than direct, as I said. So timescale and directness are key issues for measuring impact. But I think, you know, we then are justified in asking the question then, how long is needed before we can really expect to see cultural change? We could counterpose some of this with sort of some other examples of countries where they've taken no action whatsoever, and yet they've got relatively high numbers of women in information communication technologies. And research has pointed, for example, to the case of Korea and Ireland, which are both countries that are doing very little in this field and yet have and yet have quite high numbers. So there's a sort of dangerous question, but I think a question that social policy analysts need to ask themselves, the hard question of what, you know, whether how effective social policy is at all. I still believe it is effective, and I still believe that doing nothing is not an option. But what I do believe is, and this is sort of research finding from other analysis of other gender equality policies that I've undertaken, is that what's really important is the way that interventions are knitted together as packages of interventions. And I very firmly believe that the weakness of the UK situation in the past was that so much of what we did was piecemeal, was poorly embedded, was very unambitious and had a very, very short time scale and attempted to intervene in a very small and targeted area. There's nothing wrong with being targeted and focused. I think that's fine. But I think one has to be focused within the context of seeing where other interventions complement and can support whatever you're doing. So I think, you know, finally then, what might we learn about all this, and what might we apply in other contexts? Firstly, that evaluation and constant iteration of any change model are vital. Then we need a long time scale. And finally, that interventions really need to be joined up with other wider social policy changes. So, gloomy message, but I do think policy is moving in the right direction. I just think that those kinds of preconditions are necessary. Otherwise, we're going to keep on waking up on bad mornings and seeing no sign of positive change.